JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3 Stardust Crusaders changed a lot when it comes to the standard JoJo formula, adopting a Monster of the Week approach to enemy design, which allowed Hirohiko Araki to experiment more with creativity when it comes to writing his fights, viewing it more as designing a puzzle for his protagonist to solve. And while some fights were close calls and we saw some people who were passionately loyal to Dio defeated, once the Crusaders actually reached Egypt, the series would need to raise the bar on the danger level compared to the previous threats, in order to avoid hitting a lull in the narrative, which was achieved perfectly through the introduction of End-Duel. End-Duel is the blind minor antagonist and the first of the 9 Glory God stand users that the Crusaders encounter over the course of Part 3. Being a skilled stand user from birth, his fight can be seen as the narrative equivalent of a video game skill check boss fight, pushing the Crusaders to their breaking point and establishing the threat that would come in the form of the 9 Glory God users coming up. Though before we get too deep into that, let's first understand the meaning behind his name and design. Starting first with his design, End-Duel was created to reflect his Egyptian origins, with his design seemingly in reference to Antonio Lopez's Tales from 1001 Nights, which isn't too strange for Araki, who took a lot of influence from Lopez's work in his early career. Along with this, the Tales of 1001 Nights is a compilation of many cultural stories, especially Egyptian ones, so it would fit that the first person that the crew would face off against in Egypt who had an Egyptian god named Stan would be influenced visually by, of course, Egyptian culture. On top of that, the name End-Duel is rather interesting, being a direct reference to the Senegalese singer, songwriter, and composer Youssou N'Dour, which is a name I probably butchered. But around the time of Part 3's release, N'Dour was returning to the international spotlight, not only being part of the Passion album by Peter Gabriel, which was the soundtrack for the movie The Last Temptation of Christ, and could in part play to how N'Dour had a Christ-like worship of Dio as a Messiah and Savior figure, but along with this, N'Dour was releasing a new album called Set, which I feel could play into a part to why Araki chose N'Dour as N'Duel's influence, as Set is the name of one of the glory gods, but it's not N'Duel's glory god name, so I'm not 100% sure if that actually factored into it. Though, I do believe that his name might have also been chosen to play off of Abdul's character, given that Abdul and N'Duel have stands that are elementally opposed to each other, as N'Duel's stand, Geb, is a long-range bound stand that takes the form of a shapeless mass of water, which is about half a canteen's worth of water, but assumedly can spread beyond its body mass since it can create a car-sized mound of quicksand. Though beyond this, the body can be molded into different shapes, most commonly taking the form of a large tentacle-like arm with a clawed hand at the tip. Now, ability-wise, Geb is pretty simple, with its major ability being water amorphism, which essentially means that N'Duel can mold Geb's body into whatever shape or solidity that he desires, minus actually becoming a solid or a gas, giving N'Duel tons of different methods for attacking, be it either slicing his enemies with a claw-like hand, stabbing or slicing them with aqua jet levels of pressure, or even creating a wall of water to protect himself, though Geb being actually bound to water means that N'Duel is partly subjected to the damage inflicted onto it that would, hurt water, the best way I could put it, as seen when the burns inflicted by Magician Red appear on N'Duel himself. But essentially he is immune to more physical based attacks like the Fool's slashes or Star Platinum's punches. And while Geb's malleability is a serious danger to anyone it targets, what really makes the stand shine is its speed and more importantly its range, as due to N'Duel's own blindness, his Geb possesses a terrifyingly long range, being able to battle from kilometers away from his target, with N'Duel being 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles away from the Crusaders during their fight. Though with this said, Geb doesn't act as N'Duel's eyes. Instead, he uses his own walking stick to read the sonar waves from the ground and motions Geb to attack based on those, which means that Geb can be tricked rather easily, and even is avoidable if you don't make a sound. But N'Duel does have some tricks to get around this. Firstly, for those traveling through the air, N'Duel can use Geb to kick up dirt or sand to read the particles in the air in a similar way to a submarine sonar wave. And the reason that N'Duel is able to do this is thanks to a real-life natural phenomenon where people who lose one of their 5 senses tend to gain a superhuman level increase to their others, especially if they lose that sense in their early life. Examples being, people who are born blind tend to have a good level of hearing, where the reverse, someone born deaf, tend to have good eyesight. And this is a phenomenon that Araki liked so much that he recycled it into a future antagonist in Part 6. Now, Geb gets his name from the Egyptian god of the earth, Geb, considered to be one of the most important Egyptian gods in the Egyptian mythos, as he is the father of vegetation, earthquakes, and snakes? Though his connection to the earth and quakes likely influenced Araki's decision to give Endul sonar-based sight, as you can track earthquakes with their seismic activity. Along with this, it takes the form of water because Araki had recently heard a story about an incident where someone drowned via just a simple cup's worth of water, which compelled him to want to write a scene where someone drowned in the desert, given how strange that idea sounded, which in turn really helped Endul and Geb stand out. Also, I think Araki took that drowning on a cup of water thing a little bit too close to heart, given one of his author notes.
I must be the only one who cares, but I often nearly drown myself. Not in the sea or in a river, no, I narrowly escape death drinking a glass of water. I only need a mouthful of water to suffocate, and I find myself unable to breathe. Generally, if I stay calm, I manage to get my breath back little by little, but recently I almost passed out. That was a close one. That day, I miraculously escaped death to everyone's indifference.
I hope he doesn't take it too far. But beyond this, it would also seem that the Geb fight itself is somewhat based on 1990's Tremors, a movie that was fresh in the minds of Japanese audiences at the time of Geb's introduction, given the chapter was released 2 months after that movie had just entered Japanese theaters. The movie itself took place in the desert valley town of Perfection, Nevada, and featured creatures called graboids who would dig through the earth and hunt via sound. The Geb fight itself has a couple of scenes that mimic parts of the movie, and given that Araki is an enjoyer of horror movies, I wouldn't be surprised if these similarities were intentional, especially given that he has referenced multiple horror movies throughout the course of Part 3 specifically, especially since Endul's blindness is a direct reference to the blind Monsieur and Swordmaster Zatoichi, a character that spawned over 4 seasons of a TV show and 26 different movies, with the last one of the original series being released a year before the chapter that Endul debuted in. Araki saying that he did this because he viewed Zatoichi's ability as scary rather than heroic. Along with this, like other popular Japanese movies like Yojimbo, which brought us Clint Eastwood in the Dollar trilogies, Zatoichi's movies were adapted into spaghetti westerns as well, which might be why Jotaro and Endul's fight ends up being a stand quick draw contest, with both men having roots in samurais and cowboys, which is a side of Jotaro that we see captured at the end of Part 3 as well. And this is because Endul would be a sign of things to come in the later Part 3, changing up the dynamic between the Crusaders and Dio's minions, being essentially what is a skill check for the Crusaders, as he basically combines most of the standout traits of the mercenaries from the earlier fights in Part 3, with him not only being the first antagonist to actually critically injure a Crusader in battle, instead of fake critically injuring them like with Avdol and Whole Horse, Kakyoin was removed from the story for essentially the remainder of their time in Egypt up until Dio's mansion. Next to this, Endul's loyalty to Dio and range of his stand is a mixture of both Enya the Hag and Steely Dan, though to show his difference in loyalty, after his defeat, to avoid any form of interrogation from Joseph, Endul takes his life without hesitation, where Enya in turn was shocked to be killed, where Endul expected it, because he viewed Dio as a savior figure for evil, someone he did not want to let down. Also, these callbacks to earlier encounters in Part 3 might be intentional, because Endul himself says that the glory gods are the origin of the tarot. On top of this, Endul fits his role in the story perfectly, acting as a great example for the rest of the 9 glory gods, as his overwhelming abilities show the level of difficulty the Crusaders should be expecting from the oncoming threats, minus Soingo and Boingo. Along with this, the Endul fight might stick out in a lot of fans' minds, not just because it's one of Araki's most unique fights in the series, but in the OVA adaptation of Part 3, it was the first fight that a lot of non-manga readers saw, since the OVAs start with the Geb fight and it's 2 episodes long. Along with this, he also appears as a boss fight in both the Part 3 RPG and Heritage for the Future, which altogether is most of what Western audiences were exposed to when it comes to JoJo as a whole. Ultimately, for a lot of early JoJo fans in the West, Endul was their first antagonist, which made him sort of a lot of people's first impression of JoJo, and I feel that the uniqueness of his fight was a plus in that factor, especially in the early years of the JoJo fandom. And honestly, his fight is one of the coolest in Part 3, let alone the whole series, and the quick draw duel between him and Jotaro, also occurring in the final battle between Jotaro and Dio, gave the short OVA series a perfect callback to end on. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you want to support me and my channel for the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to see without your eyes, you can find this talent through buying a copy of Shimonetta, a boring word where the concept of dirty jokes doesn't exist, at buyshimonetta.com.